So welcome everybody to another conversation supporting the cycle. My name is Lauren Eckstrom, co-founder of Inner Dimension TV. And right now we are partnering with the cycle to help support the important and critical work that they are doing really all around the world. Right now, you can join Inner Dimension TV and enter the code CYCLE, C-Y-C-L-E, and 50% of your membership goes directly to support this organization. And at the end of this campaign period, Inner Dimension TV is also going to be matching those donations. So today, I am really excited to be sitting in conversation with Shreya Radhika Lakhani, who is an ambassador for the cycle. And we're going to be talking about the importance of transitions. And really what we're going to be looking at is the importance of the transition from childhood into adolescence, this transition that occurs once we enter puberty and for many people around the world, once menstruation begins. And what we're going to be touching into are the things that happen when this transition goes unacknowledged. What happens when this transition isn't celebrated? What is lost for us as individuals and for us as a global culture when this important moment in life is not spoken about, has shame around it, or is otherwise ignored? And I'll start by sharing a little bit about why this particular conversation felt so important to me. My menstruation started when I was, I think, about 12 years old. I was at my dad's house, and all of a sudden I noticed what was happening, and I was completely unprepared. I went running to my dad. I didn't want to talk about it. I said, "We have to go to the drugstore right now." And he sort of asked why. And then I think it clicked in his head and he got really uncomfortable and was like, "Oh, okay." And grabbed his keys and we ran to the car and we never spoke about it. Even though he was very kind and very supportive, it was never talked about. And then when I became pregnant with my daughter, I was so amazed at what this body could do, that this body could grow a life and bring a life into the world. And I had this thought, how different would my perception of myself be, my perception of my power and what I'm capable of, if I had grown up knowing that my body was capable of doing this incredible thing and that it was a gift to be celebrated, rather than what we find across the world, that this period literally of menstruation is something that has a lot of shame around it. Or there's this cultural messaging of, "Oh, I'm so sorry, you don't feel good, here, go take some Advil." Or the other messaging of, "Let's ignore it. Let's pretend like nothing's going on and go live your life like you normally do. Go do all the activities that you normally do, even though you have this big energetic and emotional experience happening in your life." So Shreya, I would really love for people to hear how you came into some of this work, why this work is so important to you, and some of your personal experience with entering through these transitions in your own life.
Thank you, Lauren. It's so wonderful to be here with you. Such an honor. Thank you for holding this space and for having me. It's a great joy to be an ambassador for the cycle. It's a charity very close to my heart, and I really hope that you're all learning about the work that they do and supporting us in whatever way you can. A little bit about me to start with. My heritage is Indian, but I've been born and raised in London and have still spent a lot of time in India, mostly in Rishikesh, in a spiritual community. And now I'm living in Mumbai, which is a completely different experience, living in a cosmopolitan city and working for a social impact consulting company called Dalberg. My background is actually in Sanskrit. That was my degree at Oxford, and also law. So a few different things. But the reason that this is so important to me is partly because of my own period journey. And that started when I was 11 and was extremely traumatic, actually. and I went through several surgeries, even more recently over the years. Don't have like fully fledged endometriosis, and it's honestly something that hasn't really been diagnosed. It's just kind of how it's been. But excessive bleeding, long periods of bleeding, painful, and definitely when you were talking about energetic and emotional changes, that was very resonant with me, because that's a big part of it as well. So I came across the work of the cycle in 2019 and was lucky enough to work with them in India when I lived here in 2020. And I'm just so happy to be part of this community. And I think the biggest thing for me is that this conversation is so cross-cutting across the world, whether you're from a really privileged background, whether you've grown up in the West, all the way to, you know, our on the ground work. There's so much that can be done to forward this conversation, whether it's, you know, us in our very privileged communities, just having these conversations more with our female friends and with our non-female friends, and actually talking about what we go through every month and still breaking through this stigma. And exactly like you were explaining about the language around it and the kind of feeling of what it's supposed to be like, all the way to, you know, education and infrastructure and clean water and sanitation that is needed in so many parts of the world still. So I hope that's a good overview, and I'm so excited to have this conversation with you. I know that we are going to touch on, you know, celebratory aspects of this transition, and I'm really excited to get into it.
And that was something that we spoke about that feels really important, is that we want this to be an uplifting conversation. We want this to be a hopeful conversation. And I know for myself now, as the mother to a daughter, I want this to be celebratory. And I see the way forward in the future for us to be holding these conversations even much earlier with our children across the board, no matter their gender identification, to really get them prepared. One of the things that is fascinating to me that the science and the research now demonstrates is that adolescence is the onset not just of individuation, the individual separating from the family and finding their own way, but it's also the moment of spiritual transcendence. It's a moment that is the onset of a spiritual quest and journey. And now we have science and research pointing to this, and you have such an interesting personal experience of growing up in London, but also this deeply rooted experience of living and practicing in India. And I'm curious how your experience as a woman has been impacted in terms of your own spiritual journey. What are the ways that maybe you've been supported? And also, what are the ways that maybe that's been challenging for you, or unacknowledged or uncelebrated, or possibly even pushed away or shamed?
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely lots to say there. I think, I'll just take a minute. I think if we really strip this back to basics of like what menstruation is, like honestly, it's a divine, creative, life-giving feminine energy that is instilled in women and is essentially like the creative force of the universe. So in that sense, it's so sacred, so profound, is in touch with nature and spirituality and, you know, the essence of life in so many ways. Like that's literally what it is. So in that sense, you know, it's almost insane and crazy that we don't celebrate it, because honestly, I think there are some indigenous communities that I think do. And, you know, even though in the West, before people start menstruating, I think there is normally education about it and people know that they're starting their periods. Whereas in India, I think 71% of girls don't know anything about it before they start menstruating. So I think on one level, you've got how in the West and in developed areas, there's education around it, but there's definitely not celebration, and there's not, you know, a global acknowledgement of the power of this life-giving force that we have in women. And that, I think, what's lost when we don't have that celebration, which is what you were asking earlier, is, there's a lack of self-esteem, there's a lack of self-worth, there's a lack and complete disconnection from that divine energy, from that spirituality. So that's honestly like quite tragic. And I think that denying of the sacred energy is something that all of us can kind of strive to connect with. And there is so much power in the collective nature of women coming together. We can see that in so many different parts of the world. I think there's a long way to go for the upliftment of women in general, but this is something that could be a really powerful tool for women to come together, really coming together around our periods and menstruation. It's something that unites all of us across cultures and across castes and creeds and races, I think, to answer your question about my own experience, there's two sides of it. I think on the one hand, in spiritual India and in Hinduism, you do have an acknowledgement of the divine feminine. We literally celebrate everything you could possibly celebrate about life. On every single day in India, there's probably some sort of religious festival. So in that sense, there's a culture around it, and there's a celebratory culture there. And at the same time, there's this whole stigma around it, which sadly does come from a lot of ancient texts, but around impurity, around stigma, around basically women being dirty. If you do certain things, you're going to then be infertile, and all these ideas and narratives that are so unhealthy and so damaging and so filled with shame. And that is a large part of the experience in the narrative. I think I've even had personal experiences where I've had people who I expected were very educated people or forward-thinking people in the community, and people are still indoctrinated with old patterns and old ways of thinking, and they've said, you're not allowed to do X, Y, Z. That is like very personally confronting when you're physically not allowed to do something that you feel is important to you, especially when it's like a religious or a spiritual practice, and you're barred from doing that. That's an experience of women in so many different situations and, minorities all over the world. But that feeling of like, you're not allowed here because if this thing is happening to you that is so natural and actually sacred is mad. But at the same time, I think the converse argument to it is something around how the energetics of women and of us changes and alters when we are menstruating. And I understand that. And honestly, I think that the positive spin on that would be, okay, this is a time for women to rest and to recuperate and to restore themselves. And we should give them that space, and we should allow them that nourishment. And that's now a very like radical act to be like, okay, I'm not gonna go on a hike because the tampon advert says that that's what I should do on my period. But actually, I need to rest. I'm going through this energetic and emotional change. And that listening to that is a very difficult thing to do. And I think there's so far we need to go as a society across the world on like, how do we change our lives and how do we change the way we live to include this, both on a celebratory level, on an education level, but also on a day-to-day level of there are women menstruating every day. And this is something everyone is going through. What allowances are made for that? Even in the West, I'm not sure many.
And it's such an important point because I think about the indoctrination that I've received as a woman growing up in the West and the way that period products are marketed to women. And it's this messaging of you can use this product and not change anything about your life. And in fact, you can work harder, play harder, do more by using this product. And it wasn't until I was in my early 20s, maybe somewhere between 21 and 24, where a senior female yoga teacher who at that point was probably past menopause herself, said to me, Lauren, why are you continuing to do handstands? Why are you continuing to have such strong of a practice? Why aren't you honoring this time in the month? And no one had ever asked me that question. No one had ever proposed to me the idea that I should actually consider taking care of myself in a different way rather than striving to be the same as I always was. And I found myself really questioning that because I didn't have a traumatic cycle every month. I still don't have a traumatic cycle every month. It's pretty subtle. And I have a lot of gratitude for that. But that doesn't mean that it should be ignored or unhonored. And so, this idea that we can educate the next generation of menstruating people to understand, like you've spoken to, that throughout the course of your month, there's a time in which you're feeling very internal. Then there's a time in which you're feeling very energized and creative. And then there's a time where you're feeling tired and you're letting go and you're really releasing the things that are no longer serving you or are necessary. And what a powerful way to think about a natural cycle of the body and to give the next generation of menstruating people the opportunity to every single month honor the energies that they're experiencing.
Absolutely. I think what came to mind while you were speaking was actually a really strong memory of when I was with the cycle in just outside of Chennai in 2019. And we were distributing sanitary products to girls in schools where we built toilet facilities. And I just got a really strong memory of how happy these girls were and the contrast between our experience in the East and the West, or in privileged and developing countries. That's a massive generalization, but in general, where on the one hand, you have a huge part of the world, and honestly, even in the UK and even in America, where you have period poverty, where you have a tampon shortage, where you've got tax on sanitary products. So, I mean, it doesn't even need to be delineated into East and West, but on the one hand, you've got so many girls around the world who don't have A, the education, and B, the infrastructure, and also the means and the resources to get what they need to learn about their periods and deal with their periods on a very physical, practical level. And then on the other hand, all the stuff that you just spoke about, which is so important, which is more about our kind of emotional relationship with our periods and our mental experience with it, our spiritual experience with it. There's so much to unpack there. And that's such an important and valuable and extremely critical part of this whole conversation, I think. And that's definitely what I feel is really missing in the conversation more broadly. But on that level, you know, what could it be to even eventually bring those practices to the people who are only just about making ends meet and just about, you know, getting their hands on the period products they need? And there's so much in terms of the cycle, what you mentioned. Obviously, it's so linked to the moon, it's so linked to nature and creation. And it also can be our lives and how we live them are so not in touch with that anyway. So that, I think, for me, raises a bigger question about how our lives are out of sync with nature in general, you know, how we're destroying our planet and the way we live with consumerism and capitalism and greed. That to me really fits into that conversation. And we can actually change, if we can change the ways we are like programmed and think about our lives, that would be a massive breakthrough. And doing it through this medium of doing it around our cycles would be so powerful, because as you say, there are different times of the month where even being with loads of people or communicating in a certain way or doing physical activity or not doing physical activity or having hard conversations, you know, planning or really working and grinding on something or finishing a piece of work, you know, that actually is so linked with our energy around the whole cycle. So that's a really special thing.
And I love the way that what you're pointing to. I think about how so many of the conversations I've had over the years with menstruating people in my life, and it is almost always a conversation of having to manage hormones. Oh, it's this time of month. I'm more easily triggered, or I'm more exhausted. I'm a little more sensitive. Versus, we can really teach people how to leverage their hormones to their advantage. This is the time in your cycle this month where you're really creative. Sit down, start brainstorming the next ideas that you have. Or we could really help I think about this, helping a young adolescent girl understand how to see her emotionality or her sensitivity as an opportunity, and not something to be frustrated by, or not something to have to be managed. And that would be such an opportunity for us to learn how to actually leverage our hormones to our collective advantage in terms of creation, or finishing projects like you were speaking to. What a great way to educate us on how to use these systems that are so intelligent really to our highest advantage, and to teach people, oh, you know what, maybe the time now is to put this project aside for a couple of days. And when you come back to it in a few days, you're going to have new ideas and even better ideas. You're going to have more energy. You're going to be more excited. And what a beautiful conversation that would be for a young person coming into this time of transition.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's so much guilt around that, even in general, in terms of taking rest, taking a holiday, taking a break, not just like pushing through and, being part of the rat race and being so indoctrinated, like you said, with productivity and the way we're supposed to live. This is an amazing channel and opportunity to actually have something where we're listening to ourselves to remind us that and actually change that. I think it's hard to just come up with that and we say, oh, I should have better work-life balance, or I should do X, Y, Z. This is a great chance of actually my body is telling me to rest. So I'm going to cancel all my plans this weekend to stay in bed, and that's okay.
Yeah.
I think the second thing that comes to mind is this language around our periods, in terms of, there's a phrase in India which I was quite caught off guard by, and actually it was a friend abroad who's Indian who used it, and people say, oh, I'm down. That's like the way of saying you're on your period without saying I'm on my period. You say, oh, I'm down. And that to me was like so affronting of, why don't we say we're up? Like, this is totally, we don't have to carry on this language that generations before us have used. We have an opportunity to change that. So that's one thing that I think could be so powerful and effective.
And as women, we tend to fall into this role of caretaker, right? And I see this that's been inherent in me since I was a little girl. My mom tells this story of dropping me off at daycare, and when the other children were crying, I was the one who would come and take their hands and say, it's okay, come play with me. And I think for so many of us, there's this empathy and this sense of caring for each other. And yet this time happens for us and we deny ourselves, or really, we no longer live in community and we don't have the support. We don't have the support of a community to say, hey, you know what? I'm going to go take the trash cans out for you. You know what? I'm going to help get the baby up in the morning, or let me make dinner tonight. And we don't have that kind of communal support for each other during these different cycles that we're all moving through, whether it's hormonally related or even, I think, related to the different age cycles that we move through.
Yeah, for sure. And it's honestly, I'm just thinking about how I'm always catching myself being like, you're such a hypocrite for saying this because you don't put any of these things into practice. Because I genuinely dread getting my period, or I'll find myself crying for like 2 days and I'm like, what's happening? And then I'll look at my tracker and I'll be like, oh, I'm starting my period in 2 days. And I'm personally out of sync and out of touch with that. So it's, this is a great reminder for me to make changes in my life. And my language around it is very negative. It's very much, has unfortunately been around like, I hate this, I hate being a woman, I hate my period, like this sucks, cribbing to friends. There is a support, but it's a very negative energy of like, oh my God, you too, me too. Oh, it's very kind of, it's full of shame and pain. That is unfortunately the experience we all go through. So I guess I'm just wondering how, as a collective, we can all, remind each other that this is a really sacred thing. We should celebrate it. We can maybe take small steps with our own circles of women and our own communities to do that.
And actually, it's funny that you say that. It's something that I've cultivated with the person I would consider to be my spiritual best friend. And even recently, she sent me a message and said, I noticed that you're feeling really sensitive around this particular thing that was going on in my life. And she said, your cycle is always around the same time as mine. You're always a little bit ahead of me. And so I'm just aware that this might be present for you. And we support each other in remembering that, because I joke all the time, I'm going to be 40 in 2 years. I'm like, how am I going to be almost 40? And this still catches me by surprise every month. How am I going to be almost 40? And I'm still surprised at how disruptive it can be, or eruptive it can be internally or at the level of the mind. And so I think cultivating those spiritual friendships and those safe places with another menstruating person who's able to say in such an uplifting and loving way, I want to take care of this part of you that I'm aware might be surfacing at this moment in time. One of the things, Shreya, that you shared with me that I thought was such an insight is that period poverty exists around the globe, that it isn't, and you touched on it already in this conversation, but to kind of go back to it for a moment, because I think we can have a real misperception that the disparity is between a privileged nation and a developing nation. And really, that's not true. And that we see period poverty even in what we would consider to be developed countries or very privileged societies.
Absolutely. It's really real. And actually there's a fantastic activist called Amika George, and she launched an organization in the UK called Free Periods. And she's someone who's really brought this to the front of the conversation. She's done a lot of campaigning. Government legislation's changed on taxes. She's really pushed this forward. And that was shocking to me when I found out, a lot of girls in the UK can't afford period products. That was very shocking when actually, we're doing all this work around the globe. That was quite, hard hitting, I think. And I think that also made me think about how even if you're in a very educated, privileged family growing up, you might know that periods exist. That doesn't mean that you don't also experience all of this repression and stigma and, old thinking about all of these things. I think it's very, very hard to generalize of like, India's here, London's here, we're really backwards here, they're really forwards. It's very, very hard to generalize. And I think that's just really important to know, and that it's something that every single menstruating person goes through. It doesn't differentiate,
and
it's
even
a very
right now,
intersectional.
Yeah. And even right now here in the US, we're having a product shortage. We have a shortage of tampons. And that is a problem in a country of this size, where more than half of the population is a menstruating population. And you wouldn't perceive a country like America having a problem like this, or of course, even more recently with the formula shortage. And these things are happening, and we need to be bringing attention and awareness to it. And also the misperception. I don't know if you've heard this story before, but when NASA sent a female astronaut into space, they sent her with hundreds of thousands of tampons. as if she was going to need some insane number of menstrual products. And it just shows you the misperception and the discrepancy in really understanding what this embodied experience is like. We had a movie that came out, I'm sure it's been released on a global scale now, but it came out in the US a while ago called Red. And it was this movie of this young girl at the onset of puberty and adolescence, starting her cycle. And I only watched a few minutes of it. But when her cycle starts and her mother finds out, her mother runs to the school, completely humiliates her, is trying to shove menstrual products into her hands, you know, shoving her aspirin. And it is this messaging of, this is something that when it happens to you is going to be embarrassing. You're going to feel ashamed. And it is something that everyone around you is going to somehow want to stifle or hide. Recently, a girlfriend's daughter is kind of just heading into the early stages of puberty. And we've been having this conversation. And she shared, you know, we had this beautiful conversation about what's going to happen and how would she like it to be celebrated when it actually does happen. So as we start to kind of come to a close, I would love to hear from you what your vision or your hope is for the future as we really uplift this conversation. If you could see this move in a more celebratory and inclusive direction, what would that look like for you? What would you hope for people?
Thank you, Lauren. And I think I'm also reminded of a campaign that I started with the cycle called How's Your Period? And essentially we just started posting videos of some of the ambassadors, our friends, and people in our community talking about their periods. And what we wanted to happen was for, you know, at the dinner table, you've got people of all genders, all ages, all backgrounds, whatever. You literally just ask someone, how's your period? That is such a shocking question, and it doesn't need to be. So I think something as simple as normalizing this conversation, whatever part of the world you're in, whoever you're with, whether you're with your really close friends in your community, you know, up to meeting people who you connect with and you might share a conversation with. I think this is such an important thing to destigmatize on all levels, as we discussed. So simply asking, how's your period, to the next person you meet who's a menstruating person. I think these small things could be also fun and enjoyable and, you know, shock people and then open up conversations. And that's how change will happen. That's how breakthroughs will happen. That's how new relationships will flourish and new experiences and learnings will happen for everyone. So that's one level. And I think on another level, about this celebration and about this ritual around it, I think it's something that I want to spend more time thinking about. I think it's something that we have so much potential to explore, especially those of us who do have the privilege to be having these conversations about how can we, you know, change our cycles and evolve our practices and our daily routines and what we're doing in our lives around our cycles. That's a massive privilege, and we should definitely take the most of that and take advantage of it and use it. And I'm also reminded in that sense of, there are some places in Assam and Odisha who, you know, the rituals of the menstruation are celebrated with the goddess of the monsoon. And there are rituals around this, and it's all about fertility and the earth and the mother. And that really is our ancient indigenous history and how it is in so many indigenous cultures. I think sadly, after that, especially in India, there were a lot of texts that became very damaging. Obviously, a lot of patriarchal everything has changed that a lot. And that is, you know, as a result, we're in the situation we're in now, like we discussed. So I think on a larger sense, like really tapping back into that and going back to that, that would be a really good use of all our resources and ability to kind of spend time thinking about this in a different way.
And I know one of the biggest takeaways I am walking away from this conversation with is just this reminder that our cycles are a creative endeavor, that they are a creative opportunity to go inwardly and have some inner reflection, some self-care, maybe some rest, and then moving out into the world with that next phase of energy. So often we have this perception as your cycle being a time where you're sort of hidden away, not allowed into ceremony, forced into bed, you're shut down, when really it is this opportunity to go into the cave of your soul and do some important inner inquiry and reflection. So I'm really looking forward to people reflecting on this conversation along with us, going out there and asking that question, how's your period? You know, I love when my 16-year-old stepdaughter doesn't miss a beat and will say to my husband, I have my period. I don't feel well today. My body is hurting. I would rather go to dinner than go on a big walk. And she doesn't miss a beat. You know, there's no shame, there's no hesitation. And I'll never forget the first time that happened, of being sort of stunned, because I thought, oh my gosh, I would have never said that to my dad. And I just love already seeing this next generation owning it and owning their divine feminine and owning their power. So Shreya, thank you so much for diving into this topic with us, for being a representative of the cycle. And I just want to remind everyone who has stayed with us through to the end of this conversation that right now you can go to interdimensiontv.com, join, and enter in the code CYCLE, and 50% of your membership fee is going to go directly to supporting the work that this incredible organization is doing. So thank you everybody for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you for our third and final conversation in this series.